everybody. How's everybody doing? Good? Got some voices. Well, you made it to church. I'm very proud of each and every one of you for getting out of your warm beds. My name is Erin. Announcements for you guys. Just talking about the cold for a second, because I feel like we have to. When I got in my car this morning, it was in my garage. Praise Jesus. It was 18 degrees. And I'm like, okay, I can do this. Like 18 is kind of cold, but it's January, Minnesota, whatever. Then I pull out on my driveway and I start driving. My speed is going up, but the temperature is going from like 18, 12, 11, 10, 9. And I'm like, why do I live in a state like this? This is terrible. And then by the time I pulled into church, I just live in Buffalo, so just about 10 minutes away, I pull into church and it says -12. Oh, this is so sad and depressing. But we're at church. We got here. I'm really proud of everyone. I teach in the kids ministry in the K-5, and I love doing announcements too. And so I have to bring in some of my teaching strategies here before I start with announcements. So I have a trivia question for everyone. I love doing trivia. I looked this up this morning. So February 2nd, 1996, I know some of you weren't even born yet, which makes me feel very old. I was 6 years old, and this was the coldest day on record in Minnesota. So does anyone have guesses? Shout it out. I want to hear it loud and proud. Oh, what? You cheated. How did you know that? Oh, of course you did. I can't win with these young adults now. Okay, yeah, I even had planters like Brenda and Brady and, okay, congratulations. I would give you a prize, but I don't have anything. Okay, so it was in Tower, Minnesota, like north of Duluth, and the actual temperature was -60. So glass half full kind of thing, right? I guess it's not -60. Much warmer than that, almost balmy outside. Okay, now for some announcements. Thanks for popping my bubble. I appreciate that. Now I feel a little sad that I couldn't bring new information to you. Okay, all that being said, number one, always the first thing we talk about here is if you're new at the Quarry, please don't stay new. We want to meet. We want to connect with you. We have Connect cards in the front of your seat backs to scan that and get talking to some people out in the front. They have name tags. We just want to get to know you, and we are so intentional about community here at the Quarry, so please don't stay new. Second announcement is we have our starting point lunch today after second service. This is a time where you can meet some of the leaders of the Quarry, ask any burning questions you have about how this place works. There will be food and childcare provided, so keep that in mind, and that is again today after second service. And then also we have our first family meeting of the year on February 3rd. That will be from 6:30 to 8. And in this meeting, basically, we recap what's been going on in the past year. We talk about a vision that we're going into 2025 with. And this will also be an opportunity to renew any memberships that need to be renewed. That is all three of my awesome points. And we have the very awesome treat of having our guest speaker, Mark Bjorlo. I did that. I phonetically had to sound it out. Okay. So that worked. And without further ado, while he's coming up, why don't you guys go ahead and stand up and talk about, I want you to tell a neighbor what your favorite temperature is to be outside in. Who loves the cold? Who loves the hot? It's a talking point. Get up and do it.
Well, good morning, Quarry, and warm welcome to you on this chilly day. Warm welcome online as well. Thanks for joining with us at the Quarry. We're continuing the series on emotions, and today I'm going to talk about fighting fear with faith. Fear can paralyze us, and trusting God and His presence and the power that it provides courage, God's presence, power, and care enable us to overcome and to live by faith. But first, we got to kind of talk about the reality of fear. It's funny, Isaiah, he writes, don't be afraid. And the Lord is speaking through the prophet, for I am with you. Don't be discouraged, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, and I will help you, and I will hold you up with my victorious right hand. Don't be afraid. What an interesting concept. And yet, we all have experienced moments of fear, times where we are truly afraid. I don't know if you've ever been so afraid that it felt even life-threatening kind of afraid. Years ago when I was growing up, I was into rock climbing. I know that some of you would look at me now and say, it doesn't look like the body of a rock climber. Truly, if you do nothing for 40 years, you too can have a body like this. But there is this point when I was in my teens where I was really into rock climbing and spent a lot of time in South Dakota doing the inner and outer outlets and the needles, if any of you are into rock climbing. But then one time, a group of my friends, we decided to go and try to climb Devil's Tower. How many of you have ever been to Devil's Tower in Wyoming? Incredible. It's 682 feet vertical sphere, and it's just this unbelievable rock, and a lot of climbers go and climb there, but it's a unique kind of climbing. Different than typical rock climbing where you're grabbing a hold of things. It's primarily crack climbing, and what that means is essentially you're wedging your arm and hands and feet into cracks, and then you're making a fist so you can lean back on the crack as your hand expands to fill that crack. So you're actually putting pressure against the back and the front of your hand. Well, there came a moment where it was probably 450 feet up, something like that, and we'd been climbing for a long time, and all of a sudden I realized that I didn't have sufficient callousing on my hands, and my skin had been ripping away, and I looked down on the sleeves of my shirt, and my short sleeve shirt was completely white, but my arm sleeves were all red from just the blood that was coming down my arms. I was absolutely exhausted, but I was tied in tight. There's something that when you're tied into the rock, in rock climbing, there's a command there for a climber to be securely attached to the rope, and that's called being on belay. In fact, when you begin your climb, the first thing you ever say is on belay, and then the person holding the rope says belay on. And then you say climbing, and they say climb on. And there's this correspondence with that person who's holding you. And I'm tied in, I'm on belay, I'm climbing, and I come to this moment where I'm in so much pain, the heat has been ravaging my body, and I grabbed my bottle of water only to realize I'd gone dry. I had drank all my water. Well, that was a terrifying moment. I've got what's called sewing machine legs, where my legs are just kind of like this as I'm in this, and I'm hanging onto this crack, and my crack had come to an end, and I couldn't find any place to grab onto. That was one of the few, and for sure the first moments, where as a pre-Christian, I hadn't given my life to Christ, but as a pre-Christian, I'd come to this recognition that I was afraid. I was afraid of falling. I was afraid of climbing. I was afraid that I couldn't figure out how to climb. I was tired. I was hurting. I was in pain. And for a split moment, I thought about unclipping my belay and just jumping. Thought, maybe just ending it all. It's that life flashing before your eyes kind of a moment where you wonder, is it even worth living? And then I looked down, I saw these little tiny trees, and that created another kind of a fear, just that idea of falling from that height, and somehow that fear propelled me, because fear has that reaction where you fight or you flee or you freeze, right? And in that moment, somehow it caused me to fight. And it was in that moment, too, where I realized that may have been my very first time ever praying, where I knew in that moment, I didn't really have a faith in God, but I did pray, God, you got to, if you're there, you got to get me out of here. I'm jammed up. And then in that moment of fear and prayer, I found something, I grabbed a hold of something, and I climbed. Now, when you get to the top, which eventually I did, and I couldn't believe it. I was so relieved when I got to the top. When you get to the top, it's like an enormous football field up there. It's pretty flat. And then in the very center, there's like this, they built up this little kind of a tower of rocks with a little cave in it. Inside the cave, there's a cylinder, and that cylinder is kind of like a bank cylinder where you make your deposits and you're going through the drive-thru and you put the thing in and it goes through. It's like a cylinder. And in that cylinder is a book that you unroll, and then you sign your name and where you're from and the date that you climbed. And so every climber that's climbed Devil's Tower gets to sign the book. And then they collect those books and they put them in the library every year. And so if you've ever climbed Devil's Tower, there's a permanent history in the Devil's Tower Museum of the time I made it to the top, which is like a miracle. And it's been recorded for all of history to recognize the awesomeness that is me. It's fun. When I was climbing, I discovered there's an adage that I've learned over the years called HALT. Don't make great life-changing decisions when you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. And sometimes I've switched the H from hungry to hurt. When I'm hurt, angry, lonely, tired, I don't want to make life decisions in those seasons, in those moments. What was the series when Michael talked that hurt people, right? There's this thing that happens for us where fear can paralyze us or it can drive us. We fight, we flee, we freeze. Jesus in Matthew chapter 10 said, don't be afraid of those who want to kill the body. They can't touch your soul. Fear only God. So now we've got this new introduction of an idea with fear that we just have to unpack a little bit, because the Bible does talk about a fear of the Lord or a fear of God. Jesus talks about that too. And there is this sense where Jesus draws this clear distinction between a fear perspective that's temporal versus eternal. Jesus draws this clear distinction between what humans can do and what God ultimately can do. And what humans can do can hurt our bodies. What God is doing and dealing with is something that's far more important than our physiological life, but our eternal life, our souls. God has authority over the soul, and God alone can determine our eternal destiny. And this authority surpasses any earthly power. Jesus emphasizes our need for a reverence and prioritizes God above everything. He wants us to have a sold out, all in, I'm with Jesus mentality. And this statement encourages his followers, and they wind up acting in a way that's super courageous, to have an eternal perspective. That their reverence for God would supersede their concern for their body in such a way that they live with a fear of God or a reverence or awe. When Jesus says to fear God, he's advocating not for terror in the sense of being afraid of God with God's wrath for believers, but rather a profound reverence. Healthy fear of God, acknowledging God's sovereignty, his power, his justice, his love, his authority, his holiness, over a misplaced fear of humanity and what circumstances and situations can do in our lives. There's this assurance in this of God's being in control. This verse might frighten some people. It's not meant to. It's meant to embolden, and that's what it did for the disciples. No human power can affect their eternal soul, which is securely in the hands of God. God's care for the soul, while human enemies might harm the body, they cannot touch the essence of who a person is, the soul. And that eternal relationship with God, the truth, provides immense courage to the disciples as they're facing all kinds of trials. So ultimately, what Jesus does in this text is give them courage to be on mission. And that's what I want for all of us, to be courageous with the mission that we have to impact this hurting, lost, broken world. The Quarry has such an impactful opportunity in our region and then beyond. And as we're serving, to have just a courageous attitude towards what God is calling us to. So I want us to increasingly, because of texts like this, have an eternal perspective. In our lives, we might fear rejection. I know I sometimes fear rejection. I fear criticism. I sometimes can fear physical harm for the faith that I'm trying to live out. Jesus' words remind us to focus, though, on what truly matters, our eternal relationship with a living God that loves you. Trusting his being in control, even in difficult circumstances, to have the peace or the shalom of God, knowing God's authority over our lives is absolute. To have courage as we're witnessing. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 28, Jesus encourages his disciples to shift their fear from temporary threats to eternal realities. From temporary threats to eternal realities. By trusting in God's authority and care, we really can face any kind of challenge that ever comes our way. Secondly, we want to gain God's presence in our fear. We want to have a clarity of his presence in our fear. Again, in Isaiah, we said it earlier, but do not be afraid, for I am with you, says the Lord. There's this really incredible story of a woman named Corrie ten Boom. Have you heard of her? Corrie ten Boom. She was a Dutch Christian during World War II, and her family risked their lives to protect and hide Jews from the Nazis. And while she was doing that, they were eventually caught, and her family was thrown into a concentration camp. While in that concentration camp, they smuggled in a Bible into the concentration camp, and they began to gather with some of the other prisoners and read the scriptures, and they'd pray, and they'd worship. And in praying and worshiping and reading the scriptures with this smuggled text, she later reflected on that verse from Isaiah 41:10, finding comfort in the words, "Do not be afraid, for I am with you." Even when fear threatened to overwhelm her, she clung to the promises of God and the presence of God in those promises. She described it as a light in darkness, a reassurance that no matter what they endured, God had not abandoned them. Corey's story illustrates that God's presence does not always remove us from fearful situations, but gives us courage to endure fearful situations. You might have to face all kinds of fearful situations, but by putting your trust in the Lord, you can have the courage to overcome those fearful situations. Now imagine with me this for a second. I want you to put your place in a boat in the middle of a lake. You're in the boat in the middle of a lake. It's late at night. And you're with a group of your close friends. And you and this group of close friends in the middle of a large lake experience the wind kicking up and the waves rough and kind of tossing the boat around like a little toy. And your friends and you're exhausted because you've just spent the day with your leader, Jesus. And there was an enormous crowd. And he told you, and he said to all of you, I want you to go ahead into the boat, and I'll catch up with you. And then he stayed back, and he prays. And as the storm grows stronger, you're all regretting having left him back at shore. Now the hours drag on, fear creeps in, the dark and the storm, it's relentless, and there's no sign of relief. But suddenly, one of your friends spots something off into the distance. Now, I don't know if you've ever imagined this story in the Bible where Jesus is walking on the water, but it's a storm, right? And I always kind of imagine like Puget Sound or Lake Superior or something where the waves are pretty big. And in my mind's eye, I kind of imagine Jesus kind of walking up the wave and then kind of disappearing, and then walking up the wave and then disappearing. I kind of see him coming up and down. And they're saying, where did he go? Is this a ghost? What's going on? What is that out there? What is that out there? And then a voice over the wind and the waves sounds familiar to them. Don't be afraid. Take courage. I'm here. It's Jesus walking on the water, and for him, the calm voice cuts their terror. And in that moment, the storm doesn't seem so threatening. And Peter, one of the bolder friends of yours, shouts out, Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water. And Jesus responds, come. Peter steps out of the boat. At first, he's doing it, and he's walking on water too. He's heading towards Jesus, but he notices the wind kind of whipping up and whirling around him. The circumstances of life has his eyes looking at that, and fear takes over, and he starts to sink and shouts out, save me, Lord. Immediately, Jesus reaches out and he grabs Peter's hand. He pulls him up. You have so little faith, Jesus said gently. Why did you doubt me? They climb back into the boat. Wind dies down. Storm's over. Friends are in awe because they recognize again that Jesus isn't just their teacher. He's not just our rabbi. He's the very Son of God. In this story, Jesus shows us that his presence brings peace even in the middle of life's storms. When fear overtakes us, his voice stands to remind us. Remember, verse 27, Jesus spoke to them at once. Don't be afraid. Take courage. I am here. Thirdly, faith enables us to walk through fear. Look again at Peter. In verse 29, yes, come, Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat, walked on the water towards Jesus, but when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified. He began to sink. Save me, Lord, he shouted. Peter's moment on the water is one of the most, I think, relatable episodes in the Bible because it both shows us an incredible faith and a human frailty. We see Peter exercising both faith in the midst of his weakness. Let's look a little deeper at what happens. When Peter sees Jesus on the water, he's the only disciple brave enough to speak up. Instead of just being amazed and afraid, Peter's faith drives him to action. And he calls out, Lord, if this is really you, let me come out and walk on the water with you. And this request shows this remarkable trust that Peter had in the midst of his circumstance, believing that if Jesus invites him, listen, the impossible becomes possible. In your life and in your circumstances, if Jesus invites you to take a step of faith, what you believe is impossible suddenly becomes possible. When Jesus says, come, Peter steps out of the boat, and imagine the courage that it took to leave a relatively safe boat and plant his feet on the waves. At first it works, and Peter's walking on the water, defying the laws of nature because his faith is fixed on Christ. But so often, once we take a step of faith, we start looking at circumstances again. And circumstances have a way of allowing us to feel as if the wind whipping around us and the waves that are surrounding us, the situation that we're in is so big and so dangerous and so overwhelming, and his focus shifts from Jesus to the storm, and that's where fear takes over. He begins to sink. It's a dramatic picture of what happens when we let fear replace faith. We feel like we're drowning in our circumstances. Peter does the wisest thing, though, that you could do when feeling overwhelmed. He just shouts out, "Save me, Lord!" Great response. Great response that we might all quickly come to a place of calling on the name of the Lord when we're feeling that. There's no delay. There's no lecture before rescue. And Jesus saves him first, then gently says, "Oh, you've got such little faith. Why'd you doubt?" Remember Isaiah 41:10? I got to think this might have been in Jesus' mind. "I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will hold you up with my victorious right hand." Fourth, God's care, it drives out fear. It drives out fear. There's this wonderful story of a man who was born in 1805, died in 1898, named George Mueller. Has anybody ever heard of George Mueller? George Mueller, he had all of these, all these orphanages all over England. He was an evangelist. He cared for widows and orphans, but he had orphanages all over England. And over his lifetime, it's thought that he cared for more than 10,000 kids. That's unbelievable. And he would do that relying solely on prayer for faith and provision. Mueller's life is kind of this testament of trusting in God's care even when circumstances seem dire. There's one morning where the orphans are all gathering for breakfast at the breakfast table, and one of the staff came and said to him, we have no food. And George Mueller evidently had said to the staff and the kids that he wanted them all to gather at the table and pray and thank God for the provision with which they were about to receive. And with the concluding of the prayer, a knock comes on the door where the baker of the town said, "I was awakened at 4 a.m. with a deep burden to bake extra bread for the orphanage today." And he brings all this bread to the orphanage. And no sooner does the baker leave than there's a knock on the door, and there's a milk cart out in front of the orphanage that breaks down, and the guy that was running the milk cart comes to the orphanage and says, "This milk will spoil if someone can't drink it. Is there any way that you could use it?" It's seemingly random events that God provides this full meal for these children, demonstrating his care in a very real, very tangible way. In Mueller's story, this beautifully illustrates, I think, that passage that we might see in Matthew chapter 10. In verse 29 through 31, there's this idea that God watches over sparrows and he knows the number of the hairs on our head. And Mueller's unwavering trust in God's care allowed him to overcome. God's care for us is personal. He loves you personally in a detailed way. He values the sparrows. He loves you more. Matthew 10:29 says, "What is the price of 2 sparrows? 1 copper coin? Not a single sparrow can fall to the ground without your Father knowing it, and the very hairs on your head are numbered. So don't be afraid. You are more valuable than a whole flock of sparrows." This past week, I was talking with Pastor Michael, about the sermon and what direction I was going a little bit. And we started talking about the idea that the peace of God is really the solution to fear. He goes, there's a passage in Philippians that so incredibly captures that. And I spent a lot of time this week in this passage, personally, for lots of reasons. I want to read it, and then I'm going to unpack it real quick. Don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Tell God what you need and thank Him for all that He's done. Then you will experience God's shalom, which exceeds anything we can understand. His peace will guard your hearts. His peace will guard your minds as you live in Christ Jesus. And now, dear brothers and sisters, one final thing. Fix your thoughts on what is true, what is honorable, what is right, and pure, and lovely, and admirable. Think about things that are excellent. Think about things that are worthy of praise. Keep putting into practice everything you've learned and received from me, everything you heard from me and saw me doing. Then the God of peace will be with you. This passage offers some very practical step-by-steps. First, to replace worry with prayer. Do not worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Tell God what you need and thank Him for what He's done. Fear often manifests itself in my life as worry. It causes me to spiral into a whole imagined series of what-ifs. There was a university, I wish I could remember the name of it. They did a study where they had a whole bunch of students write all of the worries. They had what they called a worry journal. All of the what-ifs that came into their mind, they wrote those things down. And then at the end of the semester, they tallied up all the worries and then asked them to critique on a scale of 1 to 10 how many of them came into real existence. And it was like less than 10% of all of their worries ever manifested themselves in any reality. 90% of the stuff they worried about never was a real issue. Thought, man, that is exactly my life. I worry about all kinds of things that aren't real issues. They could be, so probably need to worry about it. When I pray, I find that I am surrendering control of my worries to God. It's an act of faith that reminds me that He's sovereign, that He's capable of handling my fears. Gratitude shifts my focus from what's wrong to what God's done. I imagine it like this. A heavy backpack. Think about having a heavy backpack on all day long. And when you finally take it off, there's an immediate relief. Prayer is like taking off a heavy load and putting it in the hands of God. It's about giving your burden to God. It doesn't mean the problem vanishes, but it frees us from the weight of carrying the burden. And then experiencing the peace. When you experience God's peace, you wind up experiencing something that's actually supernatural. And then refocusing your thoughts. Philippians chapter 4. Dear brothers and sisters, one final thing, fix your thoughts. What is true, what is honorable. Fear often thrives in our thoughts when we're focusing on the worst case scenario. Finally, practicing what we've learned. Keep putting into practice all you learned. Fear loses its grip when we constantly walk in faith. I cook a lot. Some of you who have met me over the years know that I love to cook. One of the ways that you can see evidence of that is the burns on my arms and hands. I don't know if you've ever reached into the oven and your arm caught the burner, or if you've touched a hot pan, grabbed a hold of something that was hot. What happens is we recoil, our body quickly removes itself from that. We'll, if we're wise, reach into the freezer and grab some ice or put our hands under cold water to stop our skin from continuing to cook. That's what our emotions do for us, particularly the emotions of fear. It's an emotion we are supposed to feel. We want to feel the emotion. We want to name the feeling, and we want to express the feeling. Because we're looking at creating a culture of health, But we want to pray daily, give thanks, and intentionally focus on truth. It's like our reaction to being burned, our reaction to feeling fear should be always driving us to a place of prayer. Our goal is health. Remember, emotions are a gift. Here's our big idea. Fear loses its power when we trust in God's presence, His power, His care, and when we seek His peace through prayer and gratitude. When I was rock climbing, I would say, on belay. And the belayer would say, belay on. I would say, climbing. He would say, climb on. Today, as we close, let's do a corporate reaction. When I say on belay, you say, belay on. On belay. Climbing. God, help us be the women and men that will climb on, who will stay tied in spite of what fears we feel, in spite of what emotion we experience, that we would press into your presence and trust in your care, that your hand would be enough and sufficient for us. Help us to feel the emotions when we feel fear, but help us not stay in a place of fear. Instead, let us turn to our faith and help our faith overcome our fear. God, we want to experience your health in our lives and in our relationships. We want to experience your Spirit's presence. We realize that fear can paralyze us, but trusting in your presence and your power provides courage. So God, we want your presence, we want your power and your care that enables us to overcome our fear as we learn to live increasingly